The carriage wheels ground to a halt on the wet gravel of Ashworth Hall, and Helena Fairchild pressed her gloved palms flat against her knees to still them. She had crossed 3 counties to arrive at this gray stone giant of a house, its windows watching her like disinterested eyes. Inside, she knew, a duke waited, not for her company, but for her signature, her obedience, and her silence. Her father had described the arrangement with a cheerfulness that bordered on relief. A debt, a title in need of an heir and a cash infusion, a daughter who could read Latin but possessed no dowry worth mentioning. The arithmetic of the thing had left no room for protest. So Helena had packed 2 trunks and her mother's worn copy of Die Leiden des Jungen Werthers and kissed her father's damp cheek. She had not wept. She had decided, somewhere near Northampton, that she would instead observe everything, as a naturalist might catalogue a foreign ecosystem. The Duke of Montrose received her in a drawing-room that smelled of beeswax and old port. He was not, as the gazettes insisted, a man carved from marble. He was taller than she had imagined, dark-haired, his mouth set in a line that might once have been handsome before it hardened into something ungenerous. He bowed with mechanical precision. He did not offer his hand. "Miss Fairchild, you had a tolerable journey, I trust." "Tolerable, your grace. The roads were heavy beyond St. Albans." He nodded as though she had confirmed a suspicion. "Dinner is at 7. Mrs. Polwarth will show you to your rooms. I keep country hours. In town, the expectations are different, but you will learn them soon enough." She was not meant to reply. She was meant to curtsy and vanish. Instead, she held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, just long enough to see a flicker of impatience cross his features. Then she dipped her head and followed the housekeeper up the broad staircase, her spine a straight column of resolve. That evening, the Duke's widowed aunt, Lady Rackham, presided over a table of 8 local gentry who had been invited to inspect the new bride-to-be. The conversation flowed in well-worn channels: fox hunting, the price of wool, the scandal of a baronet's wife eloping with a riding master. Helena ate her white soup in near silence, answering only when directly addressed. She had mastered the art of being present without occupying space. It was during the fish course that Sir Martin Crewe, a florid-faced baronet with an affection for German wines, leaned toward Lady Rackham and muttered a sentence in guttural, wine-loosened German. He assumed, as they all did, that the quiet girl from a merchant's family would understand nothing. "Der Herzog wird dieses still Märchen bald laid sein. Sie hat keinen Funken Geist." The Duke will soon tire of this quiet little mouse. She hasn't a spark of wit. Lady Rackham, whose German was serviceable if accented, gave a thin smile and replied in English, "Hush, Sir Martin. She is sitting just there." Helena's spoon did not falter. She lifted a bite of turbot in dill sauce and chewed slowly, her expression as placid as a mill-pond. Inside, a cold little flame kindled. So this was the game. She understood now, the exact shape of the cage being built around her. Later in her room, she stood before the looking-glass and met her own reflection. She did not look like a mouse. She looked like a woman who had just been handed a weapon she had not expected to unsheath so soon. Her mother's voice echoed across the years. "Learn die Sprache derer, die dich unterschätzen, mein Herz. Learn the language of those who underestimate you, my heart." She opened the worn Goethe and read until the candle guttered. The Duke sent for her the next morning. A footman delivered the summons with the gravity of a man announcing a funeral, and Helena followed him to the estate office, a room paneled in dark oak and lined with ledgers. The Duke stood by the window, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him like a general surveying a battlefield he had already won. "We will entertain the Baron von Arnsberg and his wife on Thursday," he said without turning. "He is an attaché of the Prussian legation. The dinner is important. I require you to be present and to be agreeable and to speak as little as possible. Your accent," he paused, selecting the next word with surgical care. "Your accent will not benefit the conversation." Helena's fingers tightened on the fabric of her skirt. She had been taught elocution by a mother who had spoken 3 languages before she was 20. Her accent was a careful Midlands polish, free of both the broad country drawl and the affected drawl of the London drawing rooms. But she did not defend herself. She simply said, "I understand." The Duke turned then, and something in her steady expression must have unsettled him, because his brow furrowed. "Do you play cards, Miss Fairchild? Or sing? Any accomplishments that might distract the Baroness if the talk turns tedious?" "I play the pianoforte tolerably. I read German poetry. I can embroider a cushion cover, though not with any great artistry." At the mention of German poetry, his gaze sharpened, but she had pitched her voice with such casual indifference that he dismissed it as a schoolroom affectation. "Leave the poetry aside. The Baroness is not a bluestocking. Wear the ivory silk. My aunt will advise you on the rest." She was dismissed. As she passed through the morning room, she encountered her cousin, Margaret Telford, who had been engaged as her nominal companion, a post that allowed Margaret to dine on the Duke's mutton while sharpening her knives on Helena's composure. Margaret was the daughter of her mother's sister, a woman who had married well and abandoned all pretense of kindness. "You look pale, Coz," Margaret said, arranging a shawl that cost more than Helena's entire traveling wardrobe. "A pity about the dinner. The Prussian party arrived an hour ago. I heard the Baroness in the East Corridor. She speaks English like a fishwife, but her German, oh, her German is like cut glass. You will feel quite lost, I dare say." Helena smiled, a fractional curve of the lips. "I am sure I shall manage." She did not add that she had heard the Baroness too, her voice carrying through the baize door as she complained to her husband about the damp English weather and the mercantile creature the Duke was rumored to be marrying. Ein Kaufmannsmädchen, peinlich, a merchant's daughter, embarrassing. The words lodged under Helena's ribs like a needle, but the needle did not draw blood. It stitched something tight and purposeful instead. On the evening of the dinner, she dressed in the ivory silk as instructed. Margaret laced her stays with unnecessary vigor. Lady Rackham inspected her as though she were a horse at auction and pronounced her tolerably neat. Helena descended the staircase with her chin at an angle that was not quite meek, not quite defiant, a perfect, unreadable equilibrium. The Baron and Baroness von Arnsberg stood in the great hall, jeweled and imperious. The Baron was a stout man with a monocle and a mouth like a steel trap. The Baroness, a whip-thin woman in garnet velvet, raked her gaze over Helena and found her wanting with a single flick of her painted fan. "Guten Abend, Fräulein," the Baroness said, the German deliberately slow, as if addressing a child or an idiot. Then to her husband in a rapid undertone, "Sie trägt das Kleid wie ein Vogelscheuch." She wears the dress like a scarecrow. The Duke, standing beside Helena, did not react. He had not understood. He merely placed a proprietary hand at the small of her back and steered her toward the dining room, where candlelight winked off silver and crystal and the first course awaited. Helena's heart beat in slow, deliberate strokes. The stage was set. The players had taken their marks, and she, the silent mouse, had a voice none of them expected. The dining room at Ashworth Hall had been designed to intimidate. Ancestral portraits loomed in gilt frames, their subjects frozen in expressions of permanent disapproval. The chandelier, a cascade of dripping crystal, threw fractured light across the long mahogany table, where 18 guests sat arranged by rank and consequence. Helena had been placed near the foot, a deliberate signal. The Baron and Baroness, as guests of honor, flanked the Duke at the head. The first courses passed in a blur of French sauces and English circumspection. The Baroness addressed herself to the Duke in accented but precise English, complimenting his cellars, his stables, his perfectly disciplined servants. Helena she ignored, except when her gaze slid down the table with the idle curiosity one might give a mildly interesting vase. It was during the roast venison that the Baron, warmed by claret and the easy superiority of a man among social inferiors, switched to his native tongue. He leaned toward his wife and spoke in the rapid, clipped High German of the Prussian diplomatic corps. Ich begreep nicht, waarom Montrose dieses Mädchen nimmt. Kein Name, kein Vermergen, kein Aussehen, des die Mu lohnt. Het ein von den Richmond Turchtern haben können. I do not understand why Montrose takes this girl. No name, no fortune, no looks worth the trouble. He could have had one of the Richmond daughters. The Baroness nodded, dabbing her lips with a napkin. Dies Haltung. Als het sei einen Stock verschluckt, typisch English Gouvernantentochter. And that posture, as though she had swallowed a rod, typical English governess's daughter. The Duke, who had been explaining the pedigree of his dear park, paused and smiled vaguely in their direction, assuming some harmless pleasantry had been exchanged. Lady Rackham, seated nearby, stiffened but said nothing. Her German, as Helena already knew, was just good enough to catch the drift of the insult, and just weak enough to let it pass unchallenged. Helena set down her fork. The silver clinked against the porcelain with a small, distinct note. The sound, though quiet, drew the Baroness's attention. Her eyes, sharp and slightly narrowed, met Helena, across the array of hothouse flowers and gilded candelabra. Helena smiled. It was not a brittle smile, nor a simpering one. It was the smile of a woman who had been patient long enough. She lifted her wineglass toward the Baroness and spoke in German so pure, so accentless, so perfectly pitched to the educated salons of Berlin, that for a heartbeat no one quite believed the sound had come from her mouth. Ich freue mich, das Eignen der Wein mundet, Frau Baronin. Der Jogging stammt aus dem Rheingau ein kleiner Produzent, der sen Reben noch mit der Hand liest. Vielleicht Merchant sei später ein Glas mit mir teilen, während wir uns über die neuesten deutschen Roman unterhalten. Ich habe gehört, das Goth einen neuen Band in Arbeit hat. I am pleased the wine pleases you, Baroness. The vintage comes from the Rheingau, a small producer who still harvests his vines by hand. Perhaps you will share a glass with me later, while we discuss the latest German novels. I have heard Goethe has a new volume in preparation. The silence that descended was not a gradual fatting but a clean, surgical severance of sound. The Baron's monocle slipped from his eye and swung on its ribbon. The Baroness's face, already pale, turned the shade of old parchment. Her fan stopped mid-flutter. Down the table, Sir Martin Crewe choked on his venison and began to cough, his face empurpling. The Duke's hand, which had been reaching for his glass, froze in mid-air. His expression underwent a series of barely perceptible shifts: confusion, disbelief, a lightning flash of something that might have been anger, and then, beneath it all, a dawning shock that rearranged the entire architecture of his face. Helena took a sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving the Baroness. Es ist ein Schande, dass so viel Menschen die Schönheit unserer Sprache nicht zu schätzen wissen. Sie verpassen so viel. It is a pity that so many people fail to appreciate the beauty of our language. They miss so much. The Baron recovered first. He replaced his monocle with trembling fingers and inclined his head in a stiff bow. Fräulein, Sie sprechen ja ausgezeichnet. Miss, you speak excellently. Mein Mutter stammt aus Göttingen, Helena replied smoothly. Sie war der Ansicht, dass ein gut Erziehung mit der Beherrschung der Sprachen beginnt. My mother came from Göttingen. She believed that a proper education begins with the mastery of languages. Across the sea of silver and crystal, the Duke's gaze locked onto hers. The cold, careful mask he wore like a second skin had cracked, and through the fissure Helena glimpsed something raw and unguarded, a man confronted with the shattering of his own assumptions. He did not speak. He could not, perhaps, but his eyes held a question so large it filled the entire room. Helena lowered her glass and gave him the smallest inclination of her head, a gesture that was neither apology nor triumph. It was simply acknowledgement. She had shown her hand. Now the game would change. The Baroness, her composure in tatters, managed a brittle laugh. Why außergewöhnlich, she murmured. How extraordinary. But the word tasted like defeat. The guests departed in a flurry of forced pleasantries and averted eyes. The Baroness, clutching her garnet wrap, offered Helena a parting compliment so stiff it might have been dipped in starch. The Baron bowed with a clicking of heels that suggested he was already composing the letter he would write to his colleagues in Berlin about the unnerving English bride who spoke like a Hanoverian princess. The moment the last carriage rolled down the drive, the Duke's hand closed around Helena's elbow. His grip was not rough, but it was unarguable, the grip of a man accustomed to command. The library now. She did not resist. She had expected this. A storm had been gathering in the angle of his jaw since the dining room, and it required a release. She walked beside him through the portrait gallery, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and when they reached the library he released her, turned and shut the door with a controlled but definitive click. The room smelled of leather bindings and cold hearthstone. A single branch of candles burned on the reading table, throwing their shadows against the bookshelves in elongated, wavering forms. "You spoke German," he said, as though the words themselves were foreign objects he was trying to decipher. "Fluently, like a native, and you never thought to mention it. You never thought to ask." The reply was calm, almost conversational, and it struck him like a blade slipped between the ribs. His jaw tightened. "Do not play games with me, Miss Fairchild. I asked you about your accomplishments. You listed pianoforte and embroidery. You deliberately omitted the one skill that might have. Might have what, Your Grace? Impressed you, spared you a moment of social discomfort." She met his stare without flinching. "I did not omit it. I mentioned German poetry. You told me to leave poetry aside because the Baroness was not a bluestocking. You were not interested in my mind. You were interested in my compliance." The Duke's nostrils flared. He crossed to the hearth, then turned back, as though the confines of the room were suddenly too narrow to contain his agitation. "You let me walk into that dinner blind. You let the Baron and Baroness reveal themselves as the sort of people who insult their hostess in a language they assume she cannot understand." Helena's voice remained perfectly level, but a fine edge now ran beneath it. "I did not force them to speak. I did not put those words in their mouths. I merely allowed them the freedom to show you exactly what they were. If that humiliates you, Your Grace, perhaps your quarrel is not with me." Silence stretched between them, taut as a violin string. The Duke stared at her as though seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. The lines of her face, which he had catalogued as unremarkable, now seemed composed with a deliberate, intelligent poise. The quiet that he had mistaken for meekness was in fact a reservoir of self-possession so deep he could not find the bottom. "Who are you?" he asked, the question emerging low and almost unwilling. "I am the same woman you met 3 days ago. You simply chose not to look." He flinched. It was a minute reaction, a flicker at the corner of his eye, but Helena saw it. The Duke of Montrose, master of Ashworth Hall and 50,000 acres, was not accustomed to being spoken to as though he were a pupil who had failed a lesson. He drew himself up. "You should have told me. In a marriage there must be honesty." "Then let us be honest now." Helena folded her hands in front of her, a gesture that looked almost demure until one noticed the firm set of her shoulders. "You entered this arrangement because my father owed you a debt you chose to collect in flesh rather than coin. You required a wife who would produce an heir and ask nothing of you. You wanted a transaction. You did not want a partner. So do not stand there and demand the privileges of intimacy when you have offered none of its substance." The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into deep water. The Duke said nothing for a long moment. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly uncurled. When he spoke again, the arrogance in his tone had been replaced by something harder to name, a rawness, as though a layer of armor had been peeled away. "You wish to be released from the engagement." It was not a question, but she answered it regardless. "I wish to be seen. If you cannot manage that, then yes. I will walk out of this house, and you may explain my absence however you like. I will not spend my life invisible." He took a step toward her, then stopped. His face was a battlefield of conflicting impulses, pride warring with something newer, something that looked almost like respect. "I cannot release you," he said, "not because of the debt, because—" he hesitated, and the hesitation was the most honest thing he had shown her. "Because I am beginning to suspect that losing you would be a greater loss than I have the right to comprehend." Helena studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she inclined her head, a precise, dignified gesture that was neither forgiveness nor capitulation. "Then learn," she said. "I will not do the work for you." She left him standing in the library, the candle flames bending in the draft of her departure. Word of the dinner spread through London drawing rooms with the speed of a contagion. By the time the Duke and his reluctant betrothed arrived at Montrose House in Berkeley Square, the story had mutated into a dozen variations. Some said the merchant's daughter had delivered a set-down so elegant that the Prussian ambassador himself had written to commend her. Others whispered that she had learned German for nefarious purposes, correspondence with radicals perhaps, or an unsuitable continental attachment. Lady Cecily Riding, a handsome widow whose mourning for a much older husband had ended suspiciously soon, cultivated the darker version. She had angled for the Duke's hand with the precision of a military strategist, and the sudden appearance of a low-born rival with secret talents galled her beyond bearing. At a rout given by the Marchioness of Banbury, Cecily held court in a corner, her voice pitched to Carey. "It is so convenient, is it not, that she speaks German like a native? One almost wonders what else she might be concealing. A prior attachment, perhaps. The continent is full of unsuitable alliances. My late husband always said that a woman who speaks a foreign tongue too well has spent time in places she ought not to mention." The listeners tittered. The words found their way to Helena, as such words always did. Margaret, her cousin, delivered the report with ill-concealed satisfaction. "Lady Cecily is telling everyone that you are a spy, or worse. The Duke should put a stop to it, but he does nothing. How terribly mortifying for you." Helena received the news in the morning room, a cup of cooling tea balanced on her knee. She felt the sting. Of course she did. But she had long ago learned that reaction was a luxury she could not afford. She thanked Margaret for the information in a tone so pleasant it left her cousin blinking in confusion. The test came 3 nights later at the Banbury Musicale. Helena wore a gown of deep blue silk. The ivory had been retired, and entered the crowded salon with her chin at that same unreadable angle. The Duke escorted her, but his attention seemed scattered, pulled in a dozen directions. He had been distant since the library conversation, not cold but watchful, as though she had become a puzzle he could not solve and could not set aside. Lady Cecily struck during the interval, when the guests milled about with glasses of ratafia. She approached Helena with a smile that dripped honey and hemlock. "Miss Fairchild, how delightful to see you again. I have heard so much about your little talent for languages. You must find it useful coming from wherever it is you come from. Do tell me, did you learn German in a schoolroom, or was the education more informal?" The chatter nearby thinned. Heads turned. Lady Cecily's voice was pitched to reach the back rows, and it did. Helena felt the Duke's presence a few paces to her left. She did not look at him. She had learned in the library that his protection could not be relied upon. She would have to be her own shield. "I learned German at my mother's knee, Lady Cecily," she said, her tone as light as a spring breeze and twice as deliberate. She was the daughter of a professor at Göttingen. Her father corresponded with Goethe. I had a very conventional upbringing, books, music, languages. I am sorry if that disappoints anyone hopping for a more sensational history." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the listeners. Lady Cecily's smile stiffened. "How charming, a professor's granddaughter. And yet your father was, what? A merchant, I believe. One wonders how such a match came about." "My mother believed in marrying for love," Helena replied. "She was considered quite eccentric for it. I have always admired her courage." The words landed with the delicacy of a thrown gauntlet. Lady Cecily, who had married for a title and a fortune, and endured 5 years of a husband old enough to be her grandfather, had no reply. Her cheeks flushed an ugly mottled pink. The moment hung suspended, and then the Duke spoke. "Lady Cecily," his voice cut through the murmuring crowd, "I believe the second half is about to begin. Perhaps you should find your seat." It was not a defense. It was a dismissal of Cecily, not of the attack. He had spoken only to end the scene, not to champion the woman beside him. Helena understood the distinction with a clarity that felt like a door closing. She did not look at him. She turned and walked toward the music room with her shoulders straight and her heart beating a slow, disappointed rhythm. That night in her chamber at Montrose House, she summoned her maid and gave quiet instructions. The trunks were to be brought down from the attic. She would write to her father in the morning. There was a small house near Bath, left to her by her mother's aunt. It would be enough. It would have to be enough. She was folding her mother's goth into a valise when the knock came at the door. The Duke stood in the corridor, still in evening dress, his cravat slightly loosened as though he had been pulling at it. The candlelight from the wall sconce etched deep shadows under his cheekbones. He looked, Helena thought, like a man who had been running and had only just realized he was losing ground. "Your maid said you were packing." She was correct. He stepped into the room without invitation, but his usual commanding stride had been replaced by something slower, almost uncertain. His gaze fell on the open valise, the book stacked beside it, the folded shawl. "You intend to leave. I informed you at Ashworth that I would not remain invisible. You have had several weeks to demonstrate that my words meant something to you. Tonight, in that room, you said nothing when it mattered. I will not be a convenience, Your Grace. I will not be a transaction that you can keep in a drawer and pull out when you require an heir." The words were quiet and absolutely unyielding. He absorbed them like a man absorbing a physical blow. "I was a coward," he said. Helena waited. "I have been a coward since the moment you spoke German at that dinner table and made every assumption I had ever held about you collapse into rubble." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him something. "I built my life on the certainty that I understood the world, rank, order, the proper measure of people. You shattered that, and instead of thanking you for it, I have been punishing you for the discomfort of being wrong." She did not soften, she did not move toward him, but she did not tell him to leave either. "Lady Cecily's campaign against you," he continued, "is the result of my silence. I allowed the whispers to grow because I was too proud to admit publicly that I had misjudged the woman I am going to marry. That ends tonight. Tomorrow, now if you will permit it." "What do you mean?" "There is a charity assembly at the Foundling Hospital tomorrow afternoon. Half the ton will be there. I intend to escort you, and I intend to make it unmistakably clear, in front of every gossip and scandalmonger in London, that the future Duchess of Montrose is a woman of extraordinary intellect and character, and that any slight against her is a slight against my house." He paused. "But only if you agree to accompany me." Helena regarded him for a long moment. "You are asking me to trust that you will not fall silent again." "I am asking you to let me earn the trust I should have been building from the beginning." His voice dropped and the formality fell away like a discarded cloak. "I do not know how to do this. I have never had to, but I am asking you to teach me. Not to do the work for me, you were right about that, but to give me the chance to try." The candle on the dressing table guttered and steadied. Outside, a nightjar called in the Berkeley Square gardens. "One chance," Helena said. "That is all I have left to give." He nodded, and the gratitude in his face was so raw and unguarded that she had to look away. The following afternoon, under the high, echoing ceiling of the Foundling Hospital chapel, the Duke of Montrose arrived with Helena on his arm. The cream of society filled the pews, Lady Cecily among them, her fan stilled mid-flutter at the sight of the couple. The Duke did not merely stand beside Helena. He drew her into conversation with the patronesses, spoke of her scholarship with a warmth that bordered on reverence, and when the opportunity arose, he recounted the story of the Ashworth dinner himself, framing it as an example of his bride's wit and grace. He left no room for misinterpretation. By the time the choir began the opening hymn, Lady Cecily's campaign lay in ruins. A letter arrived the next morning, sealed with the von Arnsberg crest. The Baron, writing in elegant, penitent English, expressed his profound regret for the unfortunate misunderstanding and requested the honor of receiving the Duke and his bride-to-be at the Prussian embassy. The Baroness, he added, had taken to her bed with a nervous complaint and would not be in attendance. Helena read the letter aloud at the breakfast table. The Duke listened, and when she finished, he said nothing. He simply reached across the damask cloth and covered her hand with his. The gesture was tentative, almost shy, a question rather than a claim. She did not pull away. That evening, walking back from the park, the Duke stopped beneath a canopy of plane trees and turned to her. The lamplighter was making his rounds, and the gas flames bloomed along the street in small, golden sequins. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the library, that you wished to be seen. I see you now, Helena. I do not know why it took me so long, but I see you." She looked up at him, the light catching the planes of his face, and recognized something she had not allowed herself to hope for. "I know," she said. "I'm beginning to see you, too." Rose Garden at Ashworth Hall lay in the soft blue grip of twilight. Weeks had passed since London, weeks of careful conversation, of letters exchanged across the breakfast table, of silences that no longer felt like weapons but like resting places. The engagement remained, but it had transformed from a cage into something tentative and alive, a thing being built rather than imposed. Helena walked between the box hedges, her shawl pulled close against the September chill. The Duke had asked her to meet him here, and the formality of the request had struck her as both odd and endearing. He had been different since the Foundling Hospital assembly, less armored, more inclined to pause before speaking. He asked her opinions now, not as a courtesy but with genuine hunger. He had begun to learn German, fumbling through declensions in the estate office, his pride visibly struggling and visibly surrendering. She found him near the sundial, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned at her approach, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before, anxious, hopeful, stripped of every pretense. "I asked you to come because there is something I need to say," he began, "and I have been practicing it, and I will probably make a mess of it, but I owe you the attempt." He took a breath. Then, in German so careful and accented that it was almost painful to hear, he said, "Ich habe dich nicht verdient, aber ich lieb dich, und ich würde jeden Tag versuchen der Mann zu sein, den du verdienst." I have not deserved you, but I love you, and I will spend every day trying to be the man you deserve. The words were clumsy. The grammar wavered, but Helena felt them strike her chest with a force that made her breath catch. He had practiced. He had labored over a language that was not his own, because it was hers, because it was the language of her mother, the language of the weapon she had used to carve a space for herself in his world. He was returning the gift in the only way he knew how. "You mispronounced verdient," she said, her voice unsteady. He looked stricken. "I did. The I is a long vowel. You made it short." She stepped closer, and the space between them shrank to a hand's breadth. "Say it again." He swallowed, "verdient." "Better." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers cold against his warm skin. "Ich lieb dich auch," she said. "I love you too. Obwohl du die schlimmste Aussprache in ganz England hast, even though you have the worst pronunciation in all of England." His laugh was broken and relieved, and then he was pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that was entirely new, as though she were something precious that he had almost lost and would not risk losing again. She let herself be held. She let herself be seen. Their wedding took place in the village church at Ashworth on a crisp October morning. The pews held a curious assembly, the Tun in their silks and superfine, the Baron von Arnsberg looking relieved and slightly sheepish, Sir Martin Crewe studiously avoiding Lady Rackham's eye. Lady Cecily had not been invited, a social cut that was noticed and approved. Helena walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a gown of warm ivory that her mother had once described in a letter as the color of new cream. The Duke waited at the altar, and when he lifted her veil, his hand trembled. The vows were spoken in English, but as the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke leaned close and whispered, in German so quiet only she could hear, "Endlich," at last. Helena smiled, the full, radiant smile of a woman who had entered a cage and transformed it into a home. Outside the church, the villagers scattered rose petals. The bells rang out across the autumn fields, and the Duchess of Montrose, once a silent mouse, once a merchant's daughter, walked into her future with her head held high and her husband's hand warm around her own. She had not needed to beg. She had not needed to scream. She had simply spoken the truth in the language of those who had underestimated her, and in doing so, she had rewritten the entire story.